Right, this is a video about first language acquisition for Linguistics 102. Um, the chapter that we're looking at here, it's chapter 10 in the textbook. It's divided into sections much like the psycholinguistics chapter was. We start with looking at different approaches to studying how people learn their first language. And then we go through some of the specific things we know, we've observed about the development of phonological grammar, development of vocabulary, development of the morphological side of grammar, syntactic side of grammar. And then we sort of look at a higher level about how language acquisition is enabled, in terms of the environment that the learner is in and how that affects the acquisition. So if we go through bit by bit, in terms of studying it, we see the same basic distinction that we found in psycholinguistics. We see the difference between naturalistic and experimental approaches to language. So that's very, very close to the distinction between field methods and experimental methods that we saw in psycholinguistics. And we also learn about diary studies, which are the main form of naturalistic investigation of language acquisition. And so we see a few different tasks that people do, that people put in front of children. The really interesting difference, or one of the really interesting differences between studying language acquisition versus aspects of language in adults, is that when you're studying first language acquisition, you don't have a medium of communicating, like finding out what people are thinking of what's happening, because they don't have language yet. So you have to sort of come at things a bit more obliquely. A lot of adult linguistic studies have a component where you find out, okay, what do you think about this? Or you can at least, maybe it's not part of the study, but you can ask your acquaintances or people that are part of the study, the population being studied, hey, what do you think about this, and have you noticed this? You can't do that with first language acquisition, or at least not as straightforwardly. Anyway, so we learned some ways to get into, how can we find stuff out, and then we get straight into what have we found out. Phonological development is perhaps the first thing that we can start to study, before people have acquired any words or recognizable syntactic patterns. They're making sounds if it's a spoken language that they're learning, or signs if it's a gestural language that they're learning. And so we can look at what sounds or what signs or sign components do they acquire first, and what things do they do in order to be able to pronounce target words from the language in their environment. How do they change those words to make them pronounceable with the developing phonological and physiological system of speech production? After that, we look at vocabulary development. It's fascinating to look at how quickly children acquire words, what that means. What does the rate of acquisition early on mean about the final state of the grammar and perhaps communicative competence, things like that. What sorts of words are learned earlier versus later? How does the rate of acquisition change throughout the development, the acquisition of the language? How does it accelerate or decelerate or whatnot? And vocabulary development. What sort of cognitive strategies do children seem to use in order to identify words from this mass of sensory input that they eventually learn to identify as communication and start to parse out? How do they find out what the words are and what their meanings are? After vocabulary development, we look in section 10.4 at morphological development. So how did children identify that, hey, I've got these word things, but I can actually look inside the word things and sometimes pick out different elements, different morphemes, stems and affixes that carry meaning. And how do children do that? What's the general, what's the order of acquisition? Is there an order that people tend to identify morphemes, and what affects how early or late a particular morphological a particular morpheme or morphological pattern is acquired. So that's fascinating. And then syntactic development is the last sort of module of the language that the chapter looks at. And so we have various ways of naming the different stages, like how many words can a child string together and how are they constructing meaning in that way. And we look at different complex structures that eventually have to be acquired. How do children deal with those complex structures before they've acquired them, and how does that acquisition sequence play out? Lots of really fascinating questions there, and of course, if you've ever been around younger people who are acquiring the language, any language, and been able to observe the things they produce, it is fascinating. And it's adorable and it's funny and all of those things, and we get to see sort of behind the scenes, what might be driving the adorable, funny, weird little quirky things that children do as they're learning to produce language. And then finally, we have a section on what makes language possible, language acquisition possible. So what does the environment do to bootstrap or enable that? Are there things that we change about the environment when we're speaking to individuals acquiring their first language, when we're speaking to infants and young children? Do we change the way we speak and our behavior around speech in order to help them learn? Does that help them learn when we do change it? How universal is it? How do cultures differ in how how they frame communication with very young people? And there's also a little bit of a dark point here. What happens when the language environment isn't supportive of acquisition? What happens to the cognitive development? How can that be accounted for or adjusted for later on? If the environment gets improved, how can it not be improved later on? Some really interesting things to keep in mind in terms of the importance of the language environment. And there's also a little bit of discussion of the not just the external environment, but what's happening inside. What cognitive capacities are there to push along or to draw the acquisition of language along and enable the person to learn the language. Things like the idea of universal grammar, inborn knowledge, and various cognitive predispositions. So a really broad, we get a view in this chapter of a lot of different aspects of language acquisition. The researcher's perspective, how do we investigate it? Some of the specific facts, things that are acquired earlier versus later, what the path looks like, what the variation is, and then this sort of larger perspective on, what does all this knowledge tell us about how language is acquired in the first place? So really fascinating topic, and I hope you enjoy it. That's all for this video.